Hi, I'm Joe Landry.
And I'm Eamon McCarthy Earls.
And we're here to talk about the downtown Franklin area and the history of the town of Franklin. So Eamon, I thought the first block that we would talk about is the block that's over here. It's called the Morse Opera House block.
Obviously quite a few stories associated with the Morse Opera House through the years. It was Franklin's original movie theater, and before that,
Exactly.
hosted vaudeville shows and things like that when it was purely live action and no motion pictures.
That's right.
Could you tell me a little bit about the block back here?
Sure. If we were standing here in 1887, we would see the brand new Morse Opera House block and the Morse Block built. It was built in 1887, and like you said, for many years it was used for that purpose. In the early 1900s, the silent movies started coming out.
Right.
So a lot of silent movies were taken there, shown there. And also a lot of big functions, like high school graduations were held there. In the case of the Catholic Church, when they burnt down in 1900, they had Mass there. So it was used for a lot of things. Unfortunately, in 1928, in February, they had a huge fire, and it burnt, the Morse Opera House itself burnt to the ground.
Wow.
The block behind us, it was a three-story building at one time. This is actually the same building that was there at that time.
I see. So this side of the building, sort of the right-hand side where Durrani Grill is today, where there's been a succession of restaurants throughout the past 20 plus years, that is what remains of the original Opera House.
Exactly.
Now, what about this sort of low-rise, single-story section of the block today that has the Chinese restaurants and smoke shop and those things?
Well, unbelievable. The fire happened in February of 1928. By June, it was already rebuilt, and they were moving in. So it's like 4 months, 5 months later. Now, one thing that I should point out, a lot of people remember the Morse Theater. Now, the Opera House had a level floor, and it was not pitch floor. But the theater was built in 1928 as well. That was part of the new rebuilding process. And that was dedicated in October. And then eventually that closed, and then it became the Franklin Cinema later on.
And that later became the Zoetrope, which was a fixture of the downtown until the mid-2000s. I believe it was 2005 or 2006, thereabouts, that it was torn down.
Yeah, I'm not sure why, but it was torn down.
Replaced with that current block of, a small block of maybe half an acre of green space that we have right now there.
Exactly. Yep. So that's the Morse Block.
We're over on Cottage Street now, just in front of Caesar's Barbershop right behind us. And Joe, you mentioned that this area has gone through a number of different changes in terms of the layout here and the type of businesses on this just one corner right here.
Absolutely.
Since the 1940s.
Right. Well, to start off, this building right here was Sherman Chevrolet. And for those of you who have been in Franklin many years, remember Sherman Chevrolet down on East Central Street. It eventually became Keegan Chevrolet. And they went out of business, and now that building is actually still vacant, but you can still go by it and you can still see Keegan Chevrolet. And then the building behind us, where it says Caesar's Barbershop, it was a car dealer there. Donald Chapman owned that, and they sold Dodge cars. And actually it was Dodge Brothers cars. The sign that you'll see on that building would say Dodge Brothers. And then behind us, over on this side of the street, down the street you can see a funeral home, the O'Terry Funeral Home. Believe it or not, that started with Tom Keefe of Keefe Insurance.
So the namesake of Keefe Insurance, which is now over on West Central Street, pretty much diagonally opposite the Franklin Central Fire Station.
Yep.
So that was originally a Keefe company as well, the funeral home just down the road?
Thomas F. Keefe, he started the funeral home there. And then it eventually became Pizzini Funeral Home. Fred Pizzini owned it, and now it's Charles O'Terry Funeral Home.
What about the Rome Restaurant, which is obviously a fixture of downtown Franklin for many, many years?
Well, the Rome Restaurant, as you'll see in a picture of that block, you'll see there were 4 different buildings on that block. And you're going to notice that when you look at the building, you're going to see the first building to the left, which was on the corner of Cottage Street, was a little diner there. It was called the Clarke Square Diner. Well, when Brunelli family bought the block out, they decided to move that diner into where the pool room was. There used to be a pool room on the building that was...
So if we look over at the parking lot right here, that would originally have been a pool room right there?
Well, when you're looking at the front of the building, the front of the block, as you see in the picture, you're going to see Brennan's Pool Room. That eventually became the Clarke Square Diner. And then in 1948, the Brunelli family totally redid the place over, and it became Brunelli's Diner. And then in the 50s, they sold it to a gentleman by the name of Nunzio Bonina, and it became Kami's Restaurant.
Kami's Restaurant.
Kami's Restaurant. And then in 1965, the Kalachi family bought it and became the Rome Restaurant. And they kept it in that location. And then they decided to just tear down the whole block, and they built a new Rome Restaurant. And then that place burnt down, and they rebuilt it, and that's what you see today.
And when did the Rome Restaurant burn down, and when was it replaced?
Well, I'm not really sure, but I'm guessing that this present building is probably 25 years old, I'm guessing.
So early 1990s approximately?
I think so, yeah.
We're here on East Central Street, and Joe, both you and I are very familiar with the Franklin Sentinel, Franklin's local newspaper from 1879 to 1979, which documented many of the stories of the town for over a century. I understand that it had its headquarters right behind us in the center of this block of buildings. Tell me a little bit more about the other buildings behind us.
Mm-hmm. Well, we talk about the Sentinel building. Originally they were down on Depot Street, and then they moved here in later years. And they actually did the publishing right here in that building.
So the building right here in the center would have been the Franklin Sentinel?
Right, yeah. They refer to that as the Sentinel building. It's funny how a lot of buildings, the names of the buildings are named after the people that actually own them or whatever the most prominent business was at that time.
Whatever the original business in some cases, exactly. It seems like.
Right. Like the building behind us now, in its day, it was owned by Freddie Saltman, and he had Franklin Furniture there. But originally, on the building that was on the corner of Alpine Row, was owned by a guy named Alfred Farrington, and he sold furniture there. He also was an undertaker, as the advertisement said. So I was thinking, gee, he not only sold furniture to the living, he sold furniture to the dearly departed. And then we talked about the Sentinel building. There were other businesses in there as well. There was Rizzoli Drugstore was there. Lovell's Sporting Goods was there for a while. And then the building over here,
that currently has formerly Jane's Frames, now Through the Looking Glass,
right.
H&R Block, and I guess some upstairs offices.
Right. Now, originally, A.J. Cataldo, that was Amadeo Cataldo. He came to the country and he started a small little business there in 1888, Cataldo's Fruit Stand. And he eventually had that all torn down and built that building in 1923.
So Joe, we talked a moment ago about Franklin Furniture.
Yes.
And so this block right here, which was torn down and then rebuilt in 2008 with the current building, which has companies like the Gura House and the Cake Bar on the first floor, and then Dean Dorms above that. That was originally both Franklin Furniture and a couple of other businesses too.
That's right. There was a couple of small buildings over here. One of them there was a laundry in there for a while many years ago. But then, eventually, the Woonsocket Call had a branch office in there. In later years, Fico Shoe Store moved in there. And of course, at one time, there was a grocery store in there too as well, back in the 50s. It was owned by Charlie Quinn. And then eventually, he sold it to a guy named Jimmy O'Connell.
We're standing here in Clarke Square in downtown Franklin. Clarke Square has a rich history stretching back probably almost 200 years in Franklin's history as a major road intersection. There's actually photos taken on this exact spot of Franklin militiamen marshaling for the Civil War around 1861. And naturally, it's still a major crossroads of the town. Now, Joe, tell me a little bit about some of the buildings behind us, Main Street and West Central Street, and what we're seeing here today.
Pictures will show that back in the 1860s that there was a small building here, and it was a general store owned by a guy named Harry Batchelor, and he had that for many years there. And if you look at the pictures in the 1860s, you will see that that building had a porch on the front of it. And in the same building around 1900, the porch was missing. And the reason for that, I'm going to tell you a little story about that in a minute. But there were other little buildings on that same block. Well, in 1920, Harry Bullocken bought this block, and it was his idea. To tear down the buildings here and build a new building, a new business block. But apparently, he had a little bit of a problem. This land forms a triangle, and it comes to a point right about where we're standing, right about here. Well, Harry Bullocken said that, you know, I want to build this building, and I want it to come out on my land. But the town said, well, wait a minute. As we can see right here, there's a lot of traffic here. The town said that's been used by the town for so many years. That land belongs to us and not you, Harry. So he fought it in land court and he lost. But they favored with the town. So now in 1924, Harry says, I'm going to sell the land. So he sold it to a guy named Leo Flax. And Leo Flax tore those buildings down and built the buildings that are here today. Now these buildings had different businesses in them over the years. Over on the West Central Street side, we had the Electric Cafe. In this part of the building, we had such businesses as Strickland and Rustino, grocery store. In later years, we had A&D Television. Walton's Radio Shop was there. But the one business that has really stood the test of time is the barber shop. That barber shop was, I'm not sure the exact year they started there, but the Bazzanti family came to the United States in the early 20s. And Vincent Bazzanti started his business somewhere in Franklin, but he ended up in there, certainly by 1935 he was there. And as the years went on, some of his children also cut hair there as well. One of which was Edward, his son. But we didn't refer to him as Edward. We referred to him as Chiefy Bazzanti. And Chiefy cut hair for many years, until just a couple of years ago when he retired. His son is now there, so we have 3 generations of barbers in that location. And Mike still cuts hair to this day in that location.
So Joe, if we look down Main Street, we obviously have this large sort of block of a building right here, Century 21, Acapulco's, a number of other prominent downtown businesses today. What was that spot previously? What's been the story of that location?
Well, if you look at some of the old postcards and the old pictures of Franklin, you're going to see that there was a big building right here where that parking lot is. That was known as the Exchange Building. And then, if you look at pictures from the early 1900s, you're going to see 2 large houses where that block is today.
Some really nice colorized postcards from right around the turn of the 20th century that show some of that stuff, as well as the tracks in the street from the street railway that Franklin used to have back when we had a street railway just like Boston does today.
In 1944, there was a fire in that block, and it displaced a lot of the businesses until they were able to repair the damage. And then at that time, Newberry's moved into where Martin's department store was. Martin's moved over to the Exchange Block. And W.T. Grant was still there. But next to W.T. Grant was First National Food Store. But in 1946, First National Food Store moved over to West Central Street, where the Black Box is today.
I see.
The Black Box was originally built as the First National Food Store.
And this block also, I believe, hosted Stop and Shop in the 1970s and maybe early 1980s before it set up at its current location at Franklin Village Plaza, which was put up in 1988.
Right. Well,
we're standing right in front of the parking lot of 7-Eleven here in downtown Franklin on West Central Street. But this area right behind us here, this section of the parking lot, was originally a small business for a number of years.
Yep. It was Mazzone Taylor, and he was here for a number of years. He actually started over there where the Century 21 building is, and he moved over here. Before that, there was a small shoe store in this place. Now behind us over here was a garage, a gas station and a garage. And it was built by a guy named Carl Harris. And it was a 40-car garage. It was like a big, big building. And eventually, the A&P food store went in there. And a lot of people remember the A&P being in that location. One of the things that everybody remembers was the 8 o'clock coffee grinding in the machine. And you walk in, the smell was out of this world. Yeah. And then after that, we had other buildings here. In fact, for example, over here where the Black Box is today, that's where the First National moved. They built that building specifically for that in 1946. And then this building here where the macaroni place is, that was a Western Auto store there at one time. They had moved over from Main Street. And then the Electric Cafe was here before.
So we're right outside of Acapulco's right now, and behind us is the Dana Block and Franklin School for Performing Arts, as well as Rockland Trust Bank. Mm-hmm. What was the story of the Dana Block and its neighbors?
Okay, well, the Dana Block was built sometime in the early 20s, I think. And before that was an old wooden structure. I just actually saw a picture of what was there before. But the Dana Block used to be a 3-story building, and some years ago they had a fire up on the 3rd floor, so they reduced it to 2 stories. But there were different businesses in there. The most prominent one was Dana Drug, and that dates back to the 1800s. And then eventually Dana Drug became Puritan Drugs, and Puritan Drugs was owned by Ray Neighbor, and so he owned that. And then now it's Teddy Gallagher's. And then further down you would have different businesses like Costello's package store was there, and then actually the Felix Cataldo building, that was built sometime around 1909, 1910. But before that, there was a big hotel there. It was called the Hotel Darling. And then in future years, that was torn down, and that's when the Cataldo building was built. And then there were other businesses in there. One popular business was Smith's Newsstand, which eventually became Franklin News. Franklin News was owned by the Guerri Ciccone. And then there were other things. A lot of people remember when the Carousel was in there, women's clothing. And there was another one called La Bottega. And Louis Cataldo had a clothing store at the far end of the building. And then eventually he retired. And then that became Friendly Insurance and Friendly Travel Agency run by Fred Dorico.
Now that we're immediately adjacent to the Franklin Dean College stop right here with the MBTA, do you want to tell me about the coal elevator you mentioned that was originally in the location right behind us? Right.
Well, the parking lot had this big coal elevator. What they would do, right behind these bushes, there used to be railroad tracks, and what they would do is the coal cars would come in, and the coal cars had doors underneath of them. And there was a cement pit down below. And when you look at a picture of this coal elevator, you're going to see this big chute that's 45 degrees, and it went down to that pit up to the upper part of the building. And the building was up on stilts, so what the trucks would do, they would go underneath. Now I grew up on Dean Avenue, just across the street from here, and there were many summer days when I'd be out playing, and I could hear this machinery running and the coal grinding up and everything. It was really unbelievable. So behind us, right here in this parking lot, was the original Sentinel building. The Franklin Sentinel was the newspaper, and it was built there sometime in the 1800s.
So after the newspaper launched in the 1870s,
exactly.
Early 1880s.
Right. And then they tore it down in 1962 for parking. Now, one of the businesses that was there that a lot of people might remember was the Trading Post. A couple, Francis and Vera Ledbury, had their business there. And I remember going in there as a kid. I used to live on Dean Avenue right there. I'm looking at where my house used to be.
We've touched a little bit on the Ray Block and some of the other blocks here in downtown Franklin, but the Ray Block in particular seems like it had a pretty pivotal role in a lot of Franklin history from really the 1870s, 1880s up until its removal in 1970. Could you tell me a little bit more about some of the other businesses that were in there through the years?
Sure. There were many businesses. A lot of banks were in there as well. In fact, sometimes they would refer to that building as the bank building. But basically, one of the first banks that started there was a bank known as the Franklin Cooperative Bank. And then they changed their name in 1900 to Dean Cooperative Bank. So Dean Cooperative Bank really did start there. And it eventually moved over across the street to where Valley Jewelers is. They built that building specifically for Dean Cooperative.
So right over to our left here, which is currently Valley's Jewelry,
exactly.
was from the 1950s through the 1970s the location of Dean Bank before it moved to its current location on the old footprint of the Ray Block.
Right, so they came back home. But there were other banks too. There was Franklin National Bank as well, was there. And Benjamin Franklin Savings Bank actually started over on West Central Street, but they also then moved to this building as well. They were at 9 Dean Avenue. And Benjamin Franklin Savings Bank eventually built their new bank over here on what is known as the Fletcher Block in 1952, I think it was. And then eventually they became Rockland Trust. But other businesses that were in the Ray Block, actually in 1959, the Elks actually started there.
Before their current location over on Pond Street.
Well, a lot of the reason that they were on Pond Street is because they were going to demolish the building.
I see.
They needed a new home. So they went to Pond Street. They found a piece of land there and they built there. And then there was a hardware store down on the corner here, Franklin Hardware. Mr. Faber is the guy that ran that. There was a time when the electric company was located in that building, and other businesses as well. In fact, it was probably the only building, to my knowledge, that had an elevator. And as kids, there's a lot of kids in Franklin that rode up and down that elevator because we could.
Now, what was the reason for its demolition in 1970? Was there something wrong with the building, or were they just hoping to redevelop it?
I really don't know. It happened when I was in the Navy, so I really didn't know what was happening until I came through Franklin. Oh, it's gone. I really don't know why they did it. But I did hear a story that when they were trying to get the safe out of there, it was pretty difficult to get that out.
I can imagine.
So, yeah.
The post office right now is looking very, very nice after a little facelift recently with some new gold leaf on some of the on the eagle and some of the little symbols around the door. And some new paint always goes a long way.
Absolutely.
You mentioned that the post office was opened in 1935. Was that part of the Work Projects Administration during the Great Depression?
It was. The town had some money to spend, and they needed a new post office. Before, the post office was right across the street. And before that, it was in the Ray building. And before that, it was over on West Central Street where the Davis Thayer High School is.
And if you scroll back very, very far back in the town's history, I understand it was actually merged with a general store over in City Mills, which is now actually part of Norfolk, that was ceded to the creation of the town of Norfolk in 1869, but was in many ways almost the competitor to current downtown Franklin in colonial and in early Republic times.
That's exactly right. Now the post office here, as I say, it was 1935. In the mid-60s, they expanded it. So what they did is they had to vacate the place temporarily. Now on Dean Avenue, and there used to be a big building there. It was the YMCA building, which then became the Masonic Temple.
And which burned down famously in 2011. I believe it was April 2011. It torched straight to the ground.
Exactly.
And I always wonder what the heck they did for parking with all the postal trucks before they absorbed that as their parking lot, with the old Masonic Hall.
Right. When they built the post office here, previous to that, there was a big house here. It was like a big two-story house. And they actually moved the house to a vacant spot on the other corner where Eamon Street is.
I see.
Where that bank is today.
And so that was subsequently torn down on its second location?
That's right. So, but that house, they literally moved the house over, and then they built the post office.
Well, Joe, thanks for a great tour of downtown Franklin today.
Oh, it's wonderful. I love the downtown area. I mean, I grew up in this area, and I remember a lot of things, and I've done a lot of research on it, and it was just a lot of fun. So thank you for having me.
I'm Eamon McCarthy Earls.
I'm Joe Landry.
Until next time.
Thanks for watching.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.